Christmas is about the birth of the Lord Jesus Christ. We've been thinking about his impact on our lives. 2020 has been quite a year. Earlier this year, crowds formed in cities to tear down statues of men associated with the slave trade. And much has been said this year about our nation's shameful past. However, it is worth noting that huge social changes did take place in Britain in the late 18th century and on into the 19th century throughout the Victorian era. If you go back 300 years, the years 1720 to 1750 in Britain are known as the Gin Age. The results of alcoholism in Britain created many social problems. There was great poverty and violence, prostitution and murder. It was a time of social disintegration. Sport was a very perverted activity at that time. The baiting of bulls, bears and badgers and dogs with fireworks attached to them, that was a common pastime. There was cockfighting with metal spurs. Trained dogs were set on ducks. What else did people do with any leisure time they might have had? Well, bare-fisted boxing attracted crowds of thousands. Gambling was a national obsession. Crime rates were high. Thieves, robbers, highwaymen abounded. The politician Horace Walpole wrote, "One is forced to travel even at noon as if one were going to battle." It was an era of plundering. Ships would be lured onto rocks by false signals in order to shipwreck them, and then the ships were plundered whilst sailors were left to drown. Britain was a nation corrupt from top to bottom. By the beginning of the 18th century, it was Britain that had gained a monopoly of the slave trade from France and Spain. But in the 1740s, something happened. Britain experienced a religious revival. Preachers like John and Charles Wesley and George Whitefield, and here in Wales, Hal Harris, Daniel Rowland, the great hymn writer William Williams Pantycelyn. Such men began to boldly preach in the open air. There was a lot of corruption amongst the clergy of the Church of England, and so these men, unable to preach in the church, preached in the fields and in the streets. They were ridiculed as Methodists, but many thousands were affected by their message, that there is a way back to God from your sin through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Now, a byproduct of this religious revival was the social changes that took place in Britain in the subsequent Victorian era. 13 years before the Abolition Committee was formed to end the slave trade, John Wesley had published a pamphlet called Thoughts Upon Slavery. He denounced it as a horrid trade and as a national disgrace. The last letter Wesley ever wrote was to a man called William Wilberforce, himself a Christian convert and also a member of Parliament, who successfully led a lifelong campaign to abolish the slave trade. Wilberforce was part of something called the Clapham sect, a group of Christians who lived around Clapham Common. Not only did they fight the slave trade, but also they led campaigns to improve workers' conditions and reform prisons. There was also the establishing of schools and the formation of children's homes, including those of George Muller in Bristol. A direct line can even be drawn to the establishment of the RSPCA. The people behind these movements were Christians. They were products of that revival that began in the 18th century. Consciences had been awakened. People had felt their guilt. People had felt their sin. And they had gone to Jesus for rescue. And now for them, things could never be the same again. And things had to change.